we're still under monitoring, okay? Remember that this is their process of assessing the quality of control performance, right? They should be assessing the controls on a timely basis. They should be determining if they function correctly on a timely basis. That's all this one will say. Now, next the book talks about 3 phases of internal controls. Same point in my notes. The first phase is really, okay, just want to make sure we're all clear here. We are now talking about internal control evaluation. So this is what the auditors do. Before we were talking about the COSO framework. We went through the 5 different components of COSO. The first component had 7 components. Now we're talking about the auditor's evaluation of internal controls. And the book says there's 3 phases. It's not that important that you remember it as 3 total phases, because in another audit book, it could be 5, it could be 2 or 1 big phase. That's not what's important. What's important is the steps that happen in these 3 phases, okay? So in the very beginning, guess what the auditors need to do to evaluate internal controls? They have to understand the client's internal controls before they even test it. I need to know what they have, right? So they need to understand and document the client's internal controls. It's really important because in auditing, we do what's called this top-down approach. Believe it or not, it used to be the opposite way. We used to do a bottom-up approach. But later on, we realized that didn't make a lot of sense. What the top-down approach to risk says is that first, you try to determine where the risk might be in the significant accounts or significant insertions and entity level controls as a whole. And then you drill down to the more risky areas, right? First, you try to understand what's risky to the business as a whole, right? And then you drill down into the more risky areas. So it first identifies the significant accounts, right? Based on inherent risk. And then the auditor goes in and assesses the risk of material misstatements in those accounts. But to do that, they really have to understand the client's internal controls. So top-down approach to understanding risk, because auditors do risk-based audits. Why? They don't have a lot of time, right? So they can't spend their limited time resources in areas that are not material, don't have that high of a risk, when there are areas that might be way riskier, right? It's like you studying for an exam. Would you study for an exam and read the whole entire book, or would you read the sections that the professor identified would be on the exam, right? It would be a waste of time to read, all these side stories. If you only have a limited amount of time to study, you're going to study where the professor tells you to go study, right? You're not going to waste your time on other. So in doing this top-down risk-based approach, the first thing that the auditor does when evaluating controls is try to understand the entity level. Entity meaning organization. So the organization-wide controls, right? What are entity level controls? Controls are pervasive to the financial statements as a whole, right? Pervasive. You guys remember when we used that word to describe the audit opinions? Which time you give? So what does the word pervasive mean? What can you contrast that with? Right, so the opposite of that would be isolated, right? A pervasive issue means it's systematic, it's widespread, versus a compartmentalized issue would be something that's isolated, a one-off. Pervasive just means widespread, so it could be a good thing, right? Pervasive, like if I had a very astute, attentive class, I could say that their attitude towards learning is pervasive throughout the class. That could be a good thing, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but in a context of talking about errors, bad opinions, yeah, it's bad here, right? So because we're talking about issues and risk, it is bad. But that bad thing can also be isolated or compartmentalized. Here, entity level, right, means we're talking about the organization right? As Tanya gave us a good definition, things that affect the organization as a whole, right? They're going to be pervasive or systematic controls that kind of on a general level affect the business. So what are some examples of entity level controls? Management's risk assessment, right? So let's say they're doing a risk assessment of business risk, right? That assessment's not necessarily specific to only raw materials inventory or payroll. Risk assessment as a whole affects the whole entire entity. So that would be a management doing a risk assessment would be an example of an entity level control. Your book has a nice table in there, but as I've warned you before, the book is also, this is why you come to class instead of trying to read it on your own, right? The book is unnecessarily vague sometimes, right? It doesn't give you enough detail for you to actually tell what the whole control is, right? So notice in the book, it says management's risk assessment. Was there any action in that whatsoever? There's no verb, so it's not a control, the way that they wrote it. The way we would say it is management performing an business risk assessment. Right? So that's an example of an entity level control. How would the auditor assess this control? Give me some more examples of entity level controls. Angela?
Controls related to the control environment.
Let's take that one and yes, make it, more specific. So an example of entity level control for the control environment would be management putting up 1-800 whistleblower hotline posters in the break room. Notice that that's an action, it's an activity. And notice that it's specific, right? The book is too generic. In this class, you actually have to give specific examples. So that's how you make it specific. Very good. Management training employees are based on their job description when they come into the company is an example of an entity level. So notice how we took the vague thing that the book said and we actually made it specific, right? The book is giving you types. It's not giving you a specific control. Here we made it specific.